From RFN Studios, this is Radio Free Norfolk. In the midst of a summer heat wave and everything being closed, parents and children have been in tight quarters for some time now. And as the summer marches on, all that joy, fun, and frivolity normally comes to an end when September marches onto the scene, the traditional start to the new school year. However, in the midst of a pandemic, what does September even look like this year? Schools have been closed for months now. Students have been learning from home. Teachers and school administrators have grappled with what it means to have their classrooms empty and to deliver education to their students remotely. Governments have faced the heavy question of how it is we move forward safely and what will next year look like. Looking into some of these issues, we sat down with Sam Oosterhoff, the MPP for Niagara West and the Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Education, to talk about what lies ahead. We opened up the conversation with something very basic. What does education look like starting in the fall?
It's a really good question and one that we are working on, but also recognizing there are 2 months between now and September. And so we recognize that things are going to change between now and then. We are, of course, working to ensure that every single student in the province of Ontario is able to be in a classroom, that they're able to be supported, that they're able to be safe, and that they're able to proceed with the important work of being educated. But we also know that things can change very rapidly. This is a pandemic that didn't come with a playbook. We've seen here, thankfully, the numbers continue their downward trend, but we've seen in other parts of this continent, of course, south of the border, that there has been surges, and we have to avoid those surges. We have to ensure that we keep our students safe. First and foremost is the health and safety of our students. And so whether it's for elementary students or high school students, we're going to be working with our chief medical officer as well as with our partners in school boards and parents, educators. I've held 15 roundtables across the province listening to people on the ground about what their top concerns are and what their needs are. But we're still working towards having school continue, not normal, but as close to normal as possible in September, pending the numbers and, of course, the advice of our chief medical officer.
Drilling down on this point, there has been a lot of discussion on the modified school days. As of last week, some boards were talking about shutting down on 1 day a week for deep cleaning. Others continued to plan a hybrid model for the delivery of education. The ministry responded back shortly after with a memo outlining the preference for maximizing in-class instruction. Now, around these developments and on the topic of what the modified school day might look like, I pressed a bit further to understand what that means.
Well, we want, of course, to have students in class 5 days a week. But again, we recognize that there are needs in various parts of this province that as we get closer to September, we'll better be able to understand and be able to respond to. We want to see every student in the classroom if possible, but we depend on the advice of our chief medical officer. And so there have been conversations in the roundtables and the working groups about what a staggered approach would look like, what that would mean, of course, because there's unintended consequences of that type of action, thinking of childcare, thinking of needs of particular students. And we recognize that. And we want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to avoid unintended consequences, but we also recognize health and safety comes first. So the needs of this system are also very different. We have 72 school boards, ranging from Kenora or Penetanguishene to Ottawa, Niagara, and Haldimand. And so those are needs that need to be taken into consideration as those school boards move forward. If you're in a situation in the north where you haven't had a case since, let's say, March, come September, that's very different than, let's say, a Peel region, particular area where they could have had multiple cases every day. And so that's a challenge, but it's one that we are working with our school boards in order to have those various scenarios ready as we get closer to that date.
When I was a trustee, one of the things that you were always watching was the financial position of the board. Were you maximizing the dollars spent in the classroom supporting students directly? Were we as a board spending money wisely? Were we supporting the needs of our students, and what could we do better? At the board I represented, we came to find out that the board was in financial recovery and had been for some time. Amongst a number of issues was the growing reality that the costs like utilities, maintenance, staffing, and collective agreement realities, and the impact of the funding model were putting a lot of pressure on the board. We developed a plan to move out of recovery and successfully did so. All that hard work could easily be set back with rising costs. I asked Mr. Oosterhoff what the plan was to support local boards as they try to keep their staff and students safe.
Well, we have announced in the grant for student needs that just came out a few weeks ago an additional $250 per student across the province. So, significant amount of increase in funding for school boards. And that, of course, also comes with the recognition that there are going to be additional needs for sanitation. No matter the school board, there's going to be an additional focus on keeping environments extremely sanitary. We recognize that, and that's valuable. And we have advocated, or not advocated, we have given millions of dollars to school boards across the province, tens of millions of dollars, over 750 in total. But we have increased the grant for student needs by over $250 a student.
We then moved on to the idea of remote learning. Now, one of my children has found some good success in this remote learning, and it's kind of answered some of the struggles they had in the school environment. One of my other children has struggled with this environment. The question I asked was this: what is education doing to learn what the successes and the challenges are with the remote delivery of education?
We've seen so many different stories about the experience with the Learn at Home program. And of course, we recognize that the Learn at Home program ultimately is no replacement for a teacher in the classroom interacting with the child. And we are very cognizant of that. And as I've mentioned, we want to ensure that every student is back in the classroom as soon as possible. But we also recognize that there has been some benefit for certain students in being able to pursue their learning in perhaps not the same structured sense that they had prior. But there's also challenges in areas. Again, going back to Northern Ontario, I'm sure parts of Haldimand as well. In fact, I believe in the roundtable that we held in Haldimand, it was specifically mentioned a lack of broadband access. I know even in portions of my riding or Haldimand, Norfolk, Wainfleet, parts of West Lincoln, that's a concern. And so we are improving it. We have put forward a plan to work with TVO and TFO, world-class leaders in multimedia, digital media learning, to improve our Learn at Home program, to provide training for teachers, and also to provide consistency for students if they're not able to be in the class. And we also recognize that's again not the ideal, but we are committed to improving.
Teachers have been in the trenches for months now, delivering education in a pandemic. On this idea of improvement, I asked how the ministry was going to learn from teachers directly what was working for their students.
Yeah, well, we've had, we have 16 working groups at the ministry. Educators are involved in those discussions. Our labor unions, our education alliances are involved. I've held 15 roundtables, including parents, educators, trustees, people from across the province. And so our educators are working on the front lines. They're the ones who are providing this service. They're the ones who are in difficult situations, ensuring that students still receive the supports that they need. And we've heard, a need for consistency. We've heard from them the importance of teaching them how to use some of these tools. There's a huge gap between teachers in some areas and of some ages and others in their comfort levels being able to use things like Google Classroom or other D2L, other types of programs. And so we want to make sure that everyone is comfortable in that. But we also recognize that there's a prerogative to getting people back to class as soon as possible.
I also wanted to know how students with special education needs were being addressed in this current environment.
Yeah, that's very important also because there's not really a single child with special education needs, right? So they vary so much, and that's why we have the IEPs in place in order for students to be able to receive specialized education and education that meets their particular needs. Now, that challenge of addressing special education needs, of course, includes additional support staff. Of course, it includes additional funding, but it also comes down to recognizing that families have unique needs, even in the vulnerabilities perhaps that some students have underlying health conditions that they're not able to or may not be comfortable going back to the classroom as soon as possible. We've heard a lot about the importance of synchronous learning, real time, face to face learning through Zoom or other methods. And we believe that's something very important. The ministers really stress that and emphasize that. And it's also an area that we have to continue to work with our partners and make changes as things move forward.
One of the things that I have always said about education is that education must look like our communities. And I think one of the roles that the school board trustee plays is ensuring that local priorities are taken into account, that the institution doesn't get to make all the shots, but representatives from the communities get to help and shape what education looks like. I asked Mr. Oosterhoff about the value of the school board trustee.
That's a very broad question. So important. I think the role of a school board trustee to engage with the people that they represent, to engage with the school board staff, to engage in schools in their community is vital. We have 72 school boards in the province. One of the things we get a lot, to be blunt, is we get a lot of people who reach out to us at the ministry and want the ministry always right away to step in and fix everything in an individual school or even in an individual classroom, right? And the reason that is not wise is because there's so many localized needs, there's so many localized scenarios, and we recognize, there's so many different structures. So I think if you want to call it the bureaucratic structure, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but in the sense of a non-political, nonpartisan structure of everyone from the teacher in the classroom to the principal to the superintendent up to the director of education, being accountable to, if you want to call them, a board of directors, but the school board as a whole. That's an important step of accountability alongside the ministry laying out common parameters and core learning expectations, as well as the Ontario College of Teachers having a professional certification body to ensure that there's, again, base levels of understanding. But I think school trustee has a unique capability to represent localized areas and to be very engaged with parents and students who are ultimately the customers, if you want to call it that. And I know that's a bit of a simplistic way to think about it, but they're the customers of a service that is intended to be an investment in the future of our communities. And so they should be very close to the ground, and I have a lot of respect for the work that they do. And I know they take a lot of heat. I mean, we take a fair bit of comments from people who have problems with the ministry, but we also hear a lot about local school boards, and it takes a lot to put your name for office, and people are very, very passionate about education, which is a good thing. But that passion can also manifest itself in difficult conversations, and I know trustees are some of the ones who have that more than almost anybody.
One thing I always said when I was a trustee is that education has to look like our communities. And I think that the director having two bosses, if you will, the ministry and local trustees help to keep that local priority centered so that the institution doesn't fully aim towards Toronto, but out here in Haltom and Norfolk, we can actually have local control of what a really vital service is for our children, where our schools are. And I think that's, to me, it's a beautiful part of the educational system that we have in Ontario.
Yeah, I think it's it's part of the checks and balances, if you want to call it that, of our education system. That there are those methods of input from wide variety of perspectives, like you've said. And one of the things I have, and I tell this to parents quite regularly when they have a particular concern with either a particular issue at the local school board level that it's not really appropriate for the ministry to get involved with, and I'm sure you know what I'm referring to. Those types of conversations I sometimes end with, I understand your frustration. Have you ever thought about running for trustee yourself? Yep. And very rarely do they want to take that step. But the reality is, at the end of the day, if you want to get involved, it's a lot easier to go and express your concerns to someone in the ministry, but it's probably more practical if you've thought about how to get engaged locally yourself.
As a trustee, I was always very concerned with equity issues, especially how education interacts with members of the community and what those relationships look like. Unfortunately, how some students and their families interact with systems is sometimes a very different experience than what others experience. Sometimes it comes down to things like their race, social economic status, or other factors. And, in my opinion, issues like these should not make the difference when we are serving students, but they often do. Sometimes there are structural inequalities that come into play, and students face barriers. Now, one of the topics that was timely to ask a question on was around the suspension of young elementary children. Recently, the government announced a ban on such suspensions of young children, and I wanted to know why they were moving in this direction.
There's a couple of different aspects to this. One is that we've seen these suspensions be used disproportionately in marginalized or racialized communities, as well as special education students.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is this is not banning suspensions for a student in grade 10 who's doing something terrible, or even a student in grade 7 who really needs to, take be out of the school for a few days. This is about cracking down on what I'm going to refer to, and I don't mean this to be too negative, but it doesn't have a pedagogical value to simply suspend a student when you're not actually dealing with the issues at hand that are leading to maybe acting out or particular issues. There's still zero tolerance for violence in the classroom. There's still zero tolerance for that type of behavior. But there's a recognition that it's too easy in a negative way for principals simply to use their discretionary power to suspend students when they're between ages. They're such young students between grades 1 and 3. They're not benefiting from anything that happens in that suspension, and it actually can end up, we believe, and based off of the research and the advocacy that we've heard, it can actually have huge educational impacts for years to come. A single suspension can have impacts on a student's learning far into the future, and that's especially in those early years when it has a huge mental and psychological impact on those young children. So we believe there are other alternatives, and the ministry is working on bringing forward suggestions in that regard. It's important to use other alternatives to deal with situations, but we don't believe the answer is just to suspend kids.
When I sat on the student disciplinary committee, there would often be situations where a case would come forward. And when you were looking through the document that outlines the history of where the student came from, there would be an instance often in grade 3 or grade 4 where you would point to, and I would turn to the SO when everyone else wasn't in the room, and I would often say, this is where we started to lose this kid. If we would have had early interventions here, supports, and the ability to tackle some of the underlying issues, we probably wouldn't be in this disciplinary situation now.
Totally agree, and that's vital. Those early years, and again, it's not about ignoring deep problems that might present themselves and ignoring problematic behaviors. It's about dealing with those in an effective, pedagogically sound manner, and not taking the easy way out and actually having a negative impact on that child's educational journey.
A number of years ago, the Ministry of Education wanted to roll out an equity action plan. And when you looked at this plan, it was pretty good. They also wanted to bring forward some training for trustees. I attended one of these training sessions and I thought, unfortunately, they focused on all of the wrong things. One of the things they wanted to focus on was human rights case law, governance from really a business perspective, but they really didn't get an opportunity for trustees to really dig down and to understand how these issues impacted school boards. One of the things that several of us brought forward was the idea of the streaming of students and the impact it had on their lives. Recently, the government has announced an ending to the practice of streaming of students, and I wanted to ask why that was changing.
Yes, so we believe it's important that children are recognized for their potential and that they're not put into boxes based on, their origins, the color of their skin, their background, or their family. We believe it's important that they are recognized for their potential and for their interests, their ability to pursue the careers that are meaningful. And what we've seen and heard from organizations, particularly from Black community and racialized communities, but also from others, that we see this streaming as early as grade 9 is essentially forcing kids in grade 8 to make the ultimate determination about where they're going to end up down the road. And what we've seen is that can end up being used as a means of disproportionately targeting those from marginalized and racialized communities and putting them into the applied stream. And there's nothing wrong with the applied stream, and I want to be very clear about that. But we also recognize that there needs to be a level of autonomy and decision making on the students' side, and that they need to be able to have those conversations and be able to have some flexibility in grade 9 instead of being streamed so early.
Now, moving on from here, one of the other major announcements that came out was the renewed math curriculum. And as a technologist, I was thrilled to see the inclusion of coding in the new curriculum. We asked him to outline the importance of this new document.
Yeah, so really this is about, breaking down complex issues and teaching them how to decompose large problems into smaller steps and understanding sequencing. You're not going to be writing extensive code, obviously. You're not going to be deep into the bowels of that, but we are trying to encourage already from a young age a context for students to engage in iterative problem solving. So allowing them to attempt and reattempt the development of algorithms and instructions to find a solution. And we believe this is more and more important in not only the age we live in, but also from a critical thinking perspective. So of course, practically very useful. We believe there are huge amounts of growth in this space. We're seeing the need. We're seeing the industry step forward asking for people with these skills. But we also know that so much of this, if we don't start it early, it's very difficult for a 15, 16, 17-year-old to start that process of learning. Not impossible, but just far more challenging than if already at a young age they've understood the basic fundamentals of coding and breaking down things to that level and being able to attempt those types of iterative problem-solving processes, which is so beneficial for an effective coding downstream. So that's part of our math curriculum's approach, but not the only one. I'm very proud of our new math curriculum, really focused on real life lessons, I guess you could say, about particularly financial literacy, about understanding arithmetic and understanding the application. This, of course, doesn't preclude any of the the more esoteric or more theoretical courses in some of the higher levels, but it's about providing students that base level of understanding and that comfort level with things as simple as the times tables and perhaps decluttering some of the former curriculum to have a bit more of a focus on the practical skills.
One of the criticisms that's been floating around for a while has been the slowness of some of the support documents, the GSN information coming forward, the lateness of the math curriculum, and other documents related to it. We asked how the ministry would respond to some of these criticisms.
Yeah, it's a pandemic that didn't come with a playbook, and we were all trying to make sure that we can move things out as quickly as possible. Definitely some challenges in doing so, and want to be respectful of our partners and provide them with the information they need at a reasonable time. Also, a lot of challenges, I'm sure, as you know, just things that got kind of overturned, plans that we had, things that were in the works that all of a sudden for a few months got waylaid and had to be changed, and some focuses in funding, of course, that changed as well. So that's just the reality of the post-COVID world, but we're slowly picking up the pieces and getting back on our feet.
There are still a lot of unknowns surrounding what the next school year will look like in September. With about a month and a half to go, we will soon be looking the beginning of the new school year in the face, and we'll be navigating another phase of this pandemic. The intent of this interview on my part was to have an informed discussion about what is coming and what decision makers are doing and what they are talking about. What are the challenges and the successes, and where do we go from here? One thing is certain, our children need education, and as parents, we need to know what that's going to look like. I hope to continue this discussion with education and political leaders over the next several months.